I can't help but kind of get excited about today's feast day, St. Benedict, a patron of Europe, a man to which I think a lot of Christians are now turning towards for spiritual leadership once again. Someone who can perhaps give you and me a clue as how to weather the storm of a collapsing civilization. Because I think everybody, make no mistake about it, society and civilization is changing as we know it. And it seems, as usual, it's being done through violence and harshness. And I'm going to ask the question, have we learned nothing of the past century, the 20th century? I mean, we come from a Europe that was almost swallowed entirely by both atheistic, nationalist and communist socialism that was done through extreme violence, as we all know. And unfortunately, the disciples of such a rage and hatred-filled political ideologies are very much still alive today. And instead of now knowing that physical revolution will not come about, it's been done now today through political identity ideologies that seem to just pit people against themselves. It creates tribal units that's against other people, and of course it turns people against their own history. And all of that, I think, is leading to a deeper sense of selfishness, where the ego reigns supreme. And as we all know, where ego becomes the driving force in our lives, very quickly society, moral and political decay follows very soon afterwards. The common good is completely left out. Human dignity is left as a question mark. God is completely pushed out of family and society. And you know what, everybody, I think St. Benedict, he lived through a very similar period in history. Rome was collapsing, civilization was collapsing all around him, mainly, again, due to moral and social decay. A lack of self-control and discipline, it allowed political and moral corruption to reign supreme. Hence, he left his studies and he turned his back on worldliness and went to the cave in Subiaco for about 3 years to seek God in silence. You see, everybody, you and I live in a Europe that has, I think, pretty much given up on itself, has turned its back on a most rich and diverse history that holds, yes, some of the most cruelest and evilest of scenarios, but it's a history that also contains some of the greatest heroes the world has ever known. Genuine heroes, men and women who stood up to the plate when their country needed them the most. Men and women who became leaders by leading a life of example in which we could glimpse into what courage looks like, into what a heart set on fire with divine love looks like. And of course, I'm thinking of people like Pope John Paul II, Catherine of Siena, Edith Stein, and of course today's St. Benedict. And one thing unites these great people, these men and women who injected God literally back into society to stabilize civilization. They helped renew human dignity, self-worth. They helped to inject self-control, compassion, and care back into not only individual lives, but back into family, society, and political life as well. And of course, what united all of those people was holiness, genuine holiness. They led a holy life that had a colossal impact on society around them. And one thing I do not like is people scoffing at holiness. And I find it's done by those who should know an awful lot better. That cynicism, a cynical worldview, being sarcastic, that horrible attitude that's done to men and women who do their best to show a genuine reverence towards God. And in many ways, I believe it has severely damaged our work of evangelization. Because it's holiness, and only holiness, that will turn things around in this new century you and I find ourselves in, as it has always done. I mean, history has shown it time and time again that whenever civilization is in trouble, it has always taken a man or a woman of holiness, spiritual heroes, to help turn it around and to help it in its course correction. I mean, isn't that the story of the Old Testament? God, in his faithfulness to you and me, in seeing our lives and society kind of go off the rails. He always sends somebody to help it come back on track. And look, to live a holy life, it's going to require great change in our lives, attitude, behaviors, lifestyle, and a dependence on the Holy Spirit, rather than our own misguided ideas, our own egos and ambitions. As St. Paul said, we should be ambitious only for the higher things, for the godly things, to be holy, to strive for virtue in our lives through prayer. I mean, look, we are in a time where we need spiritual heroes once again, men and women who live a life that is centered on Jesus Christ only. And it's living a life that's centered on Christ, that you will inspire countless others to take up the baton of holiness alongside you. But this will take great courage. It'll take great guts. And it's a guts and a courage that only comes from a life dedicated to the Holy Spirit. St. Benedict, he turned to Christ when civilization was collapsing around him in a time of massive political and cultural upheaval. I think we would do well as followers of Christ to take a leaf out of his book to help inject virtue, compassion, love of neighbour back into society. And everybody, I'm going to end today with a quotation, an excerpt from, I think it was C.S. Lewis. Maybe some of you can help me. I can't find his name written to this, but I think it was C.S. Lewis who said this. He begins, "The stage is set. The modern world awaits emergence of a handful of spiritual heroes who will inspire and mobilize countless numbers of people towards a more Christ-centered way of living. The fruit is ripe on the vine, and the question is not, will God raise up great saints in our day? The question is, who will God raise up? It'll be those you will least expect and those who make themselves available to him. Throughout history, the great transformations and movements within church and society have always come from outside expected channels. First, man creates a problem, then God, in his infinite wisdom and love, provides a solution. If the problems today are greater than ever before, then God will raise up saints greater than ever before. You can be certain of one thing: as dark and as grim as things may seem for the church and society at times, these circumstances will conspire to produce groups of modern saints. God will use these circumstances to call forth men and women who will shadow the saints of the age past. The church and the world need saints, people willing to acknowledge God's will in their lives, men and women who are dedicated to prayer and striving for virtue in this life. We need great spiritual masters to teach us the way of holiness. Beyond the church, our whole culture is in desperate need of a return to virtue. But apart from striving for virtue in our own lives, how can we help God raise up the next generation of spiritual leaders?